The perfect PokéRap. Is it really perfect? What is perfection? Does perfection in art even exist? No, it doesn't. But what does exist is the next best thing. The masterpiece. Artists are remembered by their masterpieces. We don't say F. Scott Fitzgerald was a great author because of his entire library of writing. We remember him because he wrote The Great Gatsby. We remember Michelangelo for his statue of David. We remember Kanye West for that one tweet about being asleep on a flight and receiving a water bottle and then waking up being like, oh great, now I gotta be responsible for this bottle of water. Because like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Michelangelo and Kanye West, an artist's masterpiece is the culmination of their life's creativity and labour into a single expression of art. In April of 2019, artist Brian David Gilbert released his own masterpiece, the Perfect PokéRap, an 8.5-minute rap odyssey with multiple movements spanning various genres and media, and naming all 812 monsters that had been revealed in the entire Pokémon series up until that point, thus fulfilling the prophecy, you gotta catch them all. Okay, sure, sounds impressive, right? A dude lyrical miracles a bunch of made-up words. But isn't it a bit conceited to label your own magnum opus as perfect in its very title? What is it about the Perfect PokéRap that makes it such a masterpiece? Why am I asking so many rhetorical questions? Well, there's only one way to find out. So to unravel whether or not the Perfect PokéRap is a masterpiece, we first need to understand what a masterpiece is. While the term nowadays is primarily used by YouTube video essayists to mean, I like this thing, please give me clicks, if we go back to the original source, Wikipedia defines masterpiece as a work of outstanding creativity, skill, profundity, or workmanship. Meeting any one of these 4 criteria could potentially constitute a masterpiece. So if something meets all 4, then it's gotta be a masterpiece, right? Let's start with skill, in particular Brian's rapping skills. I mentioned lyrical miracle before, which is this idea of super fast rapping. Eminem is the poster child for this style of rapping. Think of his songs Godzilla and Rap God. In the opening movement of the Perfect PokéRap, Brian names 210 Pokemon over the course of 2 minutes and 8 seconds. In a particularly speedy section towards the end, he manages to list off 24 over a 10-second period. Let's compare that to the speed rap section in Rap God, in which Eminem spits 101 words in 16.5 seconds. M obviously has the much wordier bar here, 6.1 words per second, compared to Brian's rather meagre 2.4 words per second. But not all words are created equal, and some can be more of a mouthful than others, especially when you're talking about Pokemon names. I'm looking at you, Alola Mamola. Alo Mamola. It's not so much the word count we're interested in, but rather the syllable count. Brian's average word length is just over 3 syllables long, whereas Eminem's is only half that at 1.5. So when you factor in word complexity, Brian considerably closes the gap with 7.4 syllables per second compared to M's 9.6. Brian gets 77% of the way to the speediest section of Rap God, in which Eminem equates his unmatchable skill in rap with how quickly he can run off bars. The way Brian achieves this is through his rap flow. It's no coincidence that he averages 3 syllables per word, as it enables him to use the triplet flow. Brian mentions this in his presentation beforehand and calls it the Migos or Versace flow, after the Migos song Versace, which uses the flow. Versace popularized the use of the speedy triplet flow, which is often paired with minimal trap beats to create that modern hip-hop style that is so common nowadays. So not only did Brian modernize the PokéRap by updating its roster, he brought its sound into modern relevance as well. Then in a beat switch that would make Sicko Mode envious, the song transitions into its second movement, which honours the stylings of the original PokéRap. It's a more traditional, simple, boom bap kind of beat, with a more relaxed and playful flow. Brian calls it the educational rap flow, but you can definitely hear its inspiration in pioneering East Coast hip-hop acts such as A Tribe Called Quest. Not only in his flow, but also in his clever lyrical wordplay, incorporating Pokemon names as puns, and engaging in socially conscious themes such as anti-drug education. Brian is bringing together an entire history of rap into one song. From the early 90s East Coast hip-hop, to Eminem's mainstream explosion in the mid-noughties, and the late teens triplet flow, Brian showcases his skill across all these various styles, mastering the art of rapping. So yes, it is a masterpiece of skill. Let's move on to creativity. In order to understand the Perfect PokéRap's merit as a creative masterpiece, we need to understand Brian's creative process. Thankfully, he outlined exactly this in a 20-minute presentation that preceded the legendary event. In this presentation, he mentions the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is this sort of high watermark of creativity, the pinnacle of art, you could say. From the German, it translates into total artwork, and represents the coalescing of multiple art forms into a single vision. A piece of art unifying all its disparate creative elements to tell an overarching story. Brian says that in order for the PokéRap to be perfect, it needs to be a Gesamtkunstwerk. We already talked about how he brought together different styles of rap, but it needs to go much deeper than that. So he goes about trying to incorporate different art forms in order to represent various Pokemon groups. Interpretive dance, ice sculptures, a fireworks display, and so on. It would be easy for me to just end it there. Use that as evidence that the Perfect PokéRap is a Gesamtkunstwerk and therefore a creative masterpiece. But I just want to zoom out a little bit and consider the Perfect PokéRap Unraveled as an entire package, both rap and presentation, because one is not complete without the other. Sure, you could listen to the Perfect PokéRap on its own, but you wouldn't understand why it's perfect. You wouldn't know the story of Terry the Tangler, or understand the importance of the Big Pharma line as anti-drug education, or the use of audience participation. These two parts, the rap and the presentation, complete each other. And what's the definition of perfect? To bring something to completion. The Perfect PokéRap Unraveled is a Gesamtkunstwerk when viewed as a whole. It draws on the art forms of song, spoken word, dance, stand-up comedy, musical theatre, online video, lecture, PowerPoint, and unifies them into a single, complete art form. The Perfect PokéRap Unraveled is a creative masterpiece. Alright, thirdly, the Perfect PokéRap as a profound masterpiece. I've been dreading this one. As the scope of the PokéRap continues to grow with all these increasingly elaborate art forms to represent the different Pokemon, Brian eventually realizes that his ambition is too lofty and he can't achieve what he wants to within his time constraints. It's just not possible to give each and every Pokemon the unique contribution that they all individually deserve. Realistically, he can only do it for about 400 Pokemon, so would have to cut around half the Pokédex. The Perfect PokéRap would not be complete. It would not be perfect. In the lead up to the release of Pokemon Sword and Shield, it was revealed that the games would not feature all of the 890 Pokemon introduced in the series up until that point. In fact, it would only feature 400 Pokemon, less than half of the total roster. This decision created a massive rift within the Pokemon community. There were those who were okay with the smaller Pokédex, understanding that Pokemon's formula is not infinitely scalable and eventually they would have to decide who makes the cut. And then there were those who were angry at the Pokédex cull, arguing that Pokémon is the most profitable media franchise of all time, and they can afford to scale up production to include everybody's favourites. While I understand both sides of this argument, I find myself falling into the former camp. In fact, I was very much looking forward to a more curated Pokémon adventure. But my preference doesn't really stem from the logistics of making it happen, but rather the gameplay experience that it provides. Like Brian David Gilbert, I've been playing Pokémon since the very first games. We're both OG Gen 1ers. I remember a time when you couldn't avoid the rallying cries of "Gotta catch 'em all" and "Pikachu, I choose you." And though my interest has waned in and out over the years, I've still played every generation, and it's one of my all-time favourite game series. But I have a dark secret. I have never caught them all. Not when I was a child and I had nothing better to do, not in my favourite games Black and White, not even in Sword and Shield when it's become easier than ever to trade and complete your Pokédex. Pokémon to me has never been about completing a Pokédex, but rather the adventure I go on with my team of selected Pokémon and the relationship that I form with them. Brian told the story of his Tangler named Terry, and similarly I had a Whimsicott I loved in Black version named Bree. Black and White were a major shift in the series because they limited the Pokémon you could catch to just the 156 new monsters that they introduced in that region. Once you defeated the Elite Four and beat the game, you were rewarded with a second half of the map opening up and access to all your favourite old Pokémon that we all know and love. Black and White are my favourite Pokémon games because of this decision. No matter which generation was your first, Black and White emulated that by giving everybody a completely new adventure with totally new Pokémon to fall in love with. You couldn't rely on your tried and tested favourites to carry you through the game. You had to find new Pokémon to experiment with, come up with new battle strategies and team dynamics, and make some new friends. Whimsicott was not a Pokémon I initially gravitated to, but I needed a grass Pokémon, and there she was. Over time, I came to understand her defensive playstyle, and slowly grew to love how unique she was to battle with. Whimsicott is now one of my favourite Pokémon, and I only had this opportunity to bond with Bree because she was my only option. When you jam more and more Pokémon into new games of the same length, it can become overwhelming. Routes get flooded with Pokémon and you just try and catch one of each and then become paralysed with indecision as to which to choose, and then just default to your old favourites and store the rest in the computer forever. At least, that's my experience. I understand for some people, it's different. You just want to have a new adventure with your same favourite old pals and collect them all again. But it's not the reason I personally play the games. The perfect Pokemon game for me is not the one that includes every single Pokemon. It's the one that curates the experience and makes each inclusion meaningful. The slogan that resonates with me is not "gotta catch 'em all." It's "I choose you." Brian arrives at the same conclusion. He finds a loophole that enables him to include every Pokemon and fulfill the expectations set upon him, but their inclusion is ultimately meaningless. Sure, it's technically complete, but it doesn't add anything of value to the piece. Brian listing off every single Pokemon is not what makes the Perfect PokéRap a masterpiece. It's what he's chosen to do with the Pokemon he has selected, who all bring their own unique strengths and contribute to the overall goal in a meaningful way. Honestly, he puts it best himself.
It is not that we should catch them all. It is that we should love the ones we catch.
Here's the wild thing though. Game Freak announced Sword and Shield's Pokédex Carl at E3 2019 on June 12th. Brian premiered the Perfect PokéRap live at PAX East 2019 on March 30th. Brian gave a presentation outlining why including every single Pokemon doesn't make something automatically good 2.5 months before the Pokédex Carl was even announced and the controversy blew up. He predicted it like some kind of psychic Pokemon master. So yeah, I think it's profound. I suppose we've got one final criteria to meet. Workmanship. And to be honest, I've only got one thing to put up there. Brian doesn't need to do what he does. He didn't need to create an 8.5-minute song and memorize hundreds of Pokemon's names. He didn't need to find every piece of Zelda media and place them into its timelines. He didn't need to spend months growing a mustache for a single gag, or cover his apartment walls with paintings of sad clowns, or invent ska music. Thank God he did though. He doesn't need to make Unraveled because honestly the entire premise of that show is absolutely ridiculous. The amount of work that goes into every single episode is beyond reasonable, and that's just to get it into its core concept. But even then, he consistently goes beyond what anybody ever expects of him. He doesn't do that because it's his job. His job could be so much easier than that. It's admirable that he goes above and beyond to create such incredible things, but it certainly does come with a cost. It's obvious that Brian works overtime on Unraveled. He's said before that he doesn't ask for help, and if he does manage to do this all within his 9 to 5, then I honestly have no idea how. He truly is a genius. But he does it because he's passionate about it, not because he owes anybody perfection or has a contract to complete it. Unraveled is the culmination of his life's creativity and labour into a single expression of art. Unraveled is Brian David Gilbert's masterpiece, at least for now. And Brian David Gilbert is the internet's masterpiece. We absolutely do not deserve him. I'm looking at you, Alola Momo. Alola Momola? I'm looking at you, Alola Momola. Yeah.